Hi, Shreya.
Hello again, Sanatan.
Yeah. So we'll start exactly at 5
Mm-hmm.
and do a brief introduction, and then you can take over.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to this month's Pleach Talk. Our vision here at Pleach is simple: to connect to our roots. We aim to achieve this primarily by building awareness and bringing attention to the rich heritage treasures of our country through a curated dissemination of knowledge through various mediums. With this dream, we began our online Pleach Talk series featuring experts in historical heritage across the country. It has been ongoing for over 4 years now. So, our speaker today is distinguished archaeologist and researcher whose work has been significantly contributed to the understanding of visual cultures, art, temple architecture in Himachal Pradesh. So I'm very happy to welcome Ms. Shreya Gautam, founder of Speaking Archaeologically, who will be delivering a talk on the fascinating subject of early medieval temples of Himachal Pradesh, a region which with rich with its artistic, architectural, and cultural treasures, often overlooked in mainstream discourse. Ms. Gautam holds a Master of Studies in Archaeology from University of Oxford, where she specialized in areas such as Paleolithic archaeology, rock art, visual cultures of ancient worlds, and object analysis. Since founding Speaking Archaeologically, she has led numerous seminars, workshops, and site visits across North India and mentored over 50 research projects. She is also the editor of the Speaking Archaeologically Research Journal. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box. They will be addressed by the speaker at the end of the session. Ms. Shreya Gautam, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanathan, for that very kind introduction. I'm not sure I deserve all the praise you lavished at me today, but I will try to do it justice in the talk today. So without further ado, I will share my screen and we can get talking about the topic today, which is early medieval temples of Himachal Pradesh. Now, I've tried to keep this as casual as possible because I do realize that not all the audience that we have today is archaeologically oriented. So hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear me all right. Could someone please let me know?
Yes, sure. It's perfect.
All right. So today we're going to talk about early medieval temples of Himachal Pradesh. And as Dr. Sanathan probably already told you, it's not a topic that's talked about very much. And the problem arises primarily from two things. One, as you see in the picture behind you, the early medieval temples no longer look early medieval. They've been restored, adaptive reuse has been adopted, and they've been changed. So their structure looks very modern, or rather, it looks very Himachali. You don't really see an early medieval glimpse in these temples anymore. And the second big problem is we have very little literary sources left. Almost all the inscriptions from Himachal Pradesh are almost lost. There was, for the longest time, no literary tradition. So even if there were things that were recorded, no annals now survive. We've lost a lot of manuscripts. We've lost a lot of these inscriptions. A lot of epigraphical evidence of what was going on in Himachal Pradesh in the early medieval times is not really concretely available as it may be in the rest of the country. So before we begin, I would like to talk a little bit about speaking archaeologically. Dr. Sanathan has already introduced it, but I just want to do it anyway because I've got my team here somewhere in the audience, and I want all of them to know that we are very proud of what we do at Speaking Archaeologically. We're an archaeological education group that's based partly in North India and partly in the UK now, which is where I am at the moment. And we focus on object analysis, documentation of neglected and forgotten sites, as well as rescue archaeology. It was an organization that I founded nearly 10 years ago now, in 2015. And in the 10 years, we've been dedicated to producing trained young archaeologists, conservators, and art historians, as well as anthropologists who are actively taking the torch forward. Our platform is mostly public archaeology oriented. So you do not really need an archaeological background to be within Speaking Archaeologically. You could be a history student, you could be a heritage enthusiast, provided you're hardworking and you're ready to work, go out in the field, as well as research about it, which is the main thrust at Speaking Archaeologically. Research and talk about the things that are already out there. Look at the vulnerabilities, analyze those. So if you're ready to do that, Speaking Archaeologically has its doors open for you. Now, because we were in Speaking Archaeologically, somewhere between February 2016 to February 2020, we carried out one of our biggest and most important projects till date, which is the Bhima Devi Temple project. If you know anything about the organization, if you follow us on our social media channels or on our YouTube, you know for a fact that Speaking Archaeologically talks heavily about the Bhima Devi Temple project, which is by far the biggest project we've undertaken as an archaeological organization. Yes, there have been other projects, but this is the most significant one because it spanned for 4 years and there was a lot of work that was done on these ruins of temples in the lower Shivaliks. And this is essentially what brought us to the Himachali early medieval temples as well. This project involved a large-scale documentation and recording of the Gurjar Pratyahara temples, and it was conducted across 4 different states in India. It started in 2016, and it went right up until the pandemic forced us to sit down and shut it, which is when we published the report in the form of a journal that you see on the screen. So the main aim was to understand temple architecture of the Pratyahars. Himachal was nowhere in the context here. We wanted to look into where these temples were located, what was the role of the political context in shaping these temples, what were the religious implications and iconographic implications of these sites, what is this art form? Because we always study Indian early temple architecture starting from Khajuraho. Khajuraho is a set of temples built by the Chandels, and Chandels are the feudatories of the Gurjar Pratyahars, right? They're the feudal lords under the Pratyahara Empire. So, who are the Pratyahars? And why are there feudatories going on to build these temples? Now, notably, even in Himachal Pradesh, if you go to the Chamba district, which is one of the northernmost districts towards western Himachal Pradesh, it also has temples by the Varma kings, which is around the same time chronologically. We will see these temples in a minute, but they're chronologically built at the same time as the Khajuraho set of temples. Now, the question arises again, is Varmans declare themselves to be feudatories of the Gurjar Pratihars, same as the Chandela kings? So, who are the Gurjar Pratihars? Why are they not building any temples? And if they are, what are their temples like? So, some work, of course, has been done, but not a lot of work has been done archaeologically, which is where we came in as an organization and started looking into the religious and iconographic implications of these sites and how they sort of sit with the Chandela, the Varman, and other feudatory temples or other people who declare themselves to be the descendants or the relatives of the Gurjar Pratihars. And we wanted to also understand the oral traditions, the modern myths, and the modern perceptions that surround these temples. So, like you can see from the scope itself, from the aims that I've defined, it was a huge project. It wasn't something that was done in a day or a single night. It panned 4 years. It required a lot of travel. It required a lot of organization and mobilizing of resources towards these select few sites. And we went on to narrow it down to about 16 to 17 temples in North India, starting from Rajasthan and moving all the way eastwards towards Madhya Pradesh. The documentation in Madhya Pradesh is still ongoing as I speak. Now, how does this bring us to the temples of Himachal Pradesh, you might ask? It's all very well about the Gurjar Pratihars and it's all very well about the Bhima Devi temple project and everything that you are talking about. But how does Himachal Pradesh factor into this equation? The answer again is the Gurjar Pratihars. Now, here we have a map of the Gurjar Pradesh or the Pratihar Empire between the 8th and the 9th century. These are the very first few foundational centuries. This is the time that this clan emerges out of somewhere and goes on to conquer all of this. So, this 1 century between the 8th and the 9th century is when they arise somewhere here in Gujarat, if you can see my cursor. And from here, they slowly spread upwards, northwards, and eastwards. And they go on to found a huge empire within those 100 years. From these, then emerge the feudatories, whose architecture is really, really well known. Now, one big problem about built heritage in India, even sites that are protected by Archaeological Survey of India, are these are sites that were documented by the colonial people, by the British, saying these are the marvels of Indian architecture. So, virtually any site that you see today, with an exception of a handful of them, almost all important sites in India essentially followed the original survey list that was prepared in the 1800s, which talked about, oh, these are the marvels of Indian architecture. So only those sites go on to be ticketed. Only those sites go on to be recommended as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And that is a gross injustice to Indian culture and Indian heritage because undoubtedly there are more sites than this. Undoubtedly, there are more things in India that deserve attention. And while people have been able to introduce a lot of new sites which were not mentioned in the colonial survey into the UNESCO World Heritage List, by no means are our UNESCO or popular sites a true representation of Indian heritage and Indian culture. And the same is also true for Gurjar Pratihars because none of their temples were intact or surviving. And some of them weren't even discovered or excavated until after independence. The Gurjar Pratihara structures don't necessarily fit in to the colonial list. And as a result, they were never really a priority to study. So while you may have studied about the Khajuraho temples, or you may at least know about them, you probably don't know anything about the Gurjar Pratihara temples, which is a gross injustice because this is the first of its kind in terms of the Rajput architecture, in terms of the Rajput temples. Why? Because this is one of the first four patrilineal clans that go on to define the ethnic caste that we now understand as the Rajputs. They rose into power around the 7th and the 8th century. They were at some point employed with the Rashtrakuta dynasty, and from then they went on to separate themselves, form a separate identity, and declare themselves the rulers of the North. And which meant wherever they went, wherever they conquered, whatever area they invaded, they just went on to build temples there. So let's look into who the Gurjar Pratihars are, or what does our source tell us about who they are, where they came from. There's a famous Agni Kund myth or Agni Kul myth, which all of you would have come across in history books, which says at one point of time in medieval India, there were no fighters left. The Kshatriyas were all gone. So the Brahmins got together and they went on to carry out this huge sacrifice in Mount Abu in Rajasthan, which is where from the Agni Kund or from the Havan Kund, a new set of a person emerged, and that person then went on to found these dynasties. And this guy, this person who emerges out of the sacrificial fire, must much like Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, is called the Gurjar Pratihar or the Pratihar. And from him, then go on to uh, uh, found all these dynasties that are then defined as the Rajput dynasties from Rajasthan. Now, this myth was written around the 11th century. If you look at it epigraphically and if you look into what book this comes from, it comes from an account called the Nav Shashank Charitra, which was written by Padmagupta, who was the court poet of the Parmar rulers. So not Pratihar, but Parmar. And of course, it says that one of the four clans is the Parmar clans, and all of them all came out of this one man who came out of the fire. So he went on to have children. And of those four children, one of the children are the Parmar rulers. Now, this is fantastic, but this is not, this has no semblance of truth, of course, because it's a myth, right? So when the British started investigating where the Rajputs came from, they came up with this fantastic foreign origin theory. They said they are too white, they're too fair skinned, and they're too tall. And technically, if you're Indian, you're supposed to be dark, you're supposed to be diminutive, and you're supposed to be fat. And this is a very racist theory. This reeks of colonial racism. So they said the Scythians probably fathered the Rajputs, the early Rajputs. And from them, then you have these groups, the little tribal groups that reside in the Hindu Kush mountains. One of them is the Gujjar groups, which are North European mingling with the eastern parts of India. And these people then went on to become the Gurjar Pratihas. Now, it is important to state that there is no genetic evidence in this theory whatsoever. So if you meet a person invariably telling you that Gujjars are the same as Gurjar Pratihas, they are essentially throwing a very racist, a very slurry, and a very insulting theory in your face, which just says that Indians are not supposed to be fair-skinned, tall, or whatever. They are just supposed to be dark and diminutive and short-statured. And it is a very racial, very biased, very offensive way of portraying India in the West. Something that still goes on for even today. Like as a person living in the UK, I can tell you this is something that you might still hear when you introduce yourself as an Indian. That, oh no, we have a particular set of ideals in terms of what Indians look like. And if you do not subscribe to that, you're probably Mexican, you're probably Southern French, you could be anything. So maybe your family was never really Indian after all. Again, no genetic basis for this. It's just something that people assumed on the basis of skin color. And those kind of politics were very, very rampant in the early colonial period, which is where they were talking about white man's burden. Now, if you have white and black-skinned people or brown-skinned people in India at the same time, then technically there is no burden, right? The whites have already reached the subcontinent. Or if there are ethnic people who are white looking or fairer looking, then again, there is no problem. So in order to justify that theory, the colonials came up with this fantastic, scientifically unproven thing that the Gujjars is the same as the Gurjars. And hence, they are migrants from the West and not necessarily native Indians. So everything that is civilized supposedly came from the West, and hence this theory. Completely wrong. Please do not buy it. If anybody tells you this, please tell them that this is a very racial and offensive theory. Please do not subscribe to it. So archaeology now comes to our rescue. And if we pick up archaeology, let's talk about where did they come from. And in the background here, a rather shaky background, I admit, but this is the clearest picture I have, is an inscription which comes from Mandavyapur or the modern day Mandor of Rajasthan, which is located near Jodhpur. And this area is nearly 373 miles to the southwest of New Delhi. Now, it is from here that a 6th century inscription comes in, which is this inscription in the background. And it says that Gurjar Pratihars essentially were founded by a dynasty or by a set of people who were the offsprings of a Brahmin named Harichandra and a Kshatriya wife named Bhadra. And if you are anywhere in the early medieval India, if you're living in that time, caste system is very rampant, which means even a Brahmin and a Kshatriya cannot have a child which will be considered legitimate, right? So while you may have married, while you may have had children, the children will not have that social standing in early medieval time. It's very rigid, caste-wise, clan-wise. You are only supposed to marry Rajputs if you're only supposed to marry Kshatriyas if you're Kshatriyas, Brahmins if you're Brahmins. And if a Kshatriya marries a Brahmin, the offspring automatically is illegitimate. And you can see the Game of Thrones parallels here again, because illegitimate children don't really have any claim. They can neither be the king nor they can be the priest. And from this clan, this particular person emerges that goes on to become a very powerful person in the Rashtrakuta Empire. If you look at the Rashtrakuta copper plate inscriptions from this time, they will tell you that people called the Pratihars, the Gurjar Pratihars, were told to shield the border from the west. And if you go back to the map that I showed you, that is where they essentially emerge from. From Gujarat, they keep going northwards and eastwards. And because of this, because of all of this, they were employed probably by the Rashtrakutas to stay there and guard and man the borders. But when they became powerful, they then go on to replace the Rashtrakuta Empire in the west and then go on to conquer all other empires in their wake and found their own empire. These people then go on to have the tripartite struggle in the early medieval politics, which we all read about in history books. And we also know that the Gurjar Pratihars emerge victorious from the tripartite struggle in the early medieval Indian context. So if you look at it archaeologically, you have enough inscriptions to tell us who these people are, where they came from, and what they did, right? So again, other mythical origins that come from within the Gurjar Pratihar canons, not from that particular copper plate inscription that I just showed you, or the Rashtrakuta copper plate inscriptions, are their Ramayanic origins. They always trace their descent to Lakshman, the younger brother of Ram. Now, it is pertinent to mention here that if you're descended from Ram, then you are a Suryavanshi, right? But if you are descended from Lakshman, his brother, I don't know how this works, but if you descend from Lakshman or trace your descent from Lakshman, then you are Chandravanshi for some reason. Why? I do not know. But if you are from Ram's direct lineage and Lavan Kush's direct lineage, then you're Suryavanshi Rajput. But if you're Lakshman's direct descendant, you're Chandravanshi Rajputs. Also, Pandavs are Chandravanshi Rajputs. This is an important thing, and I'm mentioning this connection right here. I'll come back to this in the end. The claim that Gurjar Pratihara inscriptions of later periods, so not the 6th century inscription, but any other later inscriptions that you get from Gwalior and other places, always say that they are Chandravanshi Rajputs and they come from Lakshman. But there are also a few people who then go on to, Gurjar Pratihara kings that is, who go on to say that we are the descendants of Pandavs. Very important myth, very important connection. Please keep this in mind. And of course, there are all these texts that then come from the Pratihara court. And in the Vidyashala Bhanjika and Bala Bharata of Rajashekhar, they keep on to reiterate this myth in the 11th century. Now, who are the Gurjar Pratihars and exactly what are they doing? How do they fit into this whole story that I'm about to tell you today? They're probably an emergent class group that came out from the traditional folds of caste system, like I mentioned, and they built temples wherever they went. Once they start expanding in a political way, they go on to undertake massive construction of temples. And the one person who does this at great length is Nag Bhatta II, who's a Gurjar Pratihara king. And their temple building project becomes so rampant and widespread that they have their own phases of temple architecture. Just like the Guptas do, these people also have their own phases, which can be classified into this table that you see on the side. So in the initial phase in 725 CE, they're just experimenting with their floor plans. They're trying to build square temples, circular temples, all kinds of temples. In phase 2, it becomes slightly more standardized. This is around 800 CE. They start developing rectangular floor plans, and they go on to follow a particular kind of temple architectural style. And in the last one, they again go all out. They build all kinds of temples, but they then start narrowing down to something that is more circular or that can fit within a circle. So while the temple itself may not be circular, the overall plan of the site would be circular in nature, and that is something that they start preferring. So while studying the contextual history of these temples, because like I said, we started with studying the temple architecture of the Gurjar Pratihars, we found out that the underlying motifs behind construction of these temples were not just religious, but also economic, political, and social. They were not building temples only because they liked building temples. They were not building these structures because they liked such structures. They built these structures primarily and importantly for a lot of ulterior motives. So the same site can then be looked into from different perspectives. Now, how does this bring us back to temples of Himachal Pradesh? Elephant in the room, because you were promised I'm going to talk about temples of Himachal Pradesh. And here I am yapping on and on and on about early medieval politics and who the Gurjar Pratihars are and how they like building temples. So again, the question arises, who are these guys? What are they doing? And why are they in Himachal Pradesh again? So let's look into some of the temples of Himachal Pradesh. If we go back to the map that I showed you in the beginning, for those of you who want to see that map, we've also released the map on the Speaking Archaeologically maps page. So if you look us up on Instagram, we have a separate maps page where you can actually go and see the extent of their empire if you want to. So for ready reference, if you look into it, Himachal Pradesh actually falls into the territory of the Gurjar Pratihars. Within the first 100 years, they had captured almost all of Himachal Pradesh as we see it today. And one of the earliest temples from that period, the period of experimentation around 725 CE, is the temples of Masroor in Kangra. These are multiple rock-cut monolith temples, the only monolith temples that you find in North India. In South India, you have rampant monolithic temples. In North India, you only have one, which is this. And this is this huge boulder of rock that was then hewn into temples. And you see all kinds of temples here. Most of it was destroyed in the 1904 earthquake of Kangra. So a lot of these temple structures have fallen off. Some of them have even fallen into the pond that you see in front of it. But you can still see these structures. You can still visit it. It's one of the only two ticketed sites by ASI in Himachal Pradesh, again, because it featured into the colonial surveys. And that becomes then the yardstick of understanding what's going on with the Gurjar Pratihara architecture. Now, if you spoke to the locals will tell you that this is built by the Pandavas. Remember me telling you that Pandavas are Chandravanshi Rajputs and Gurjar Pratihars claim to be descendants of Pandavas eventually. They start with Lakshman and they go on to say, no, we came from the Pandavas. So this is an important piece of myth. Interestingly, if you look into the Adi Parv of Mahabharat, which is around chapter 14, if you're looking into an English translation, you will find the mention of Trigartha kingdom, which is where the Pandavas sought refuge during their Agyatwas, during their exile. And they then abandoned this area because they suspected being spotted and being identified. So because they were in hiding, they then went on to go away from Trigartha, and Trigartha is identified as modern day Kangra by a lot of people. It's worth mentioning that Trigartha is mentioned in Mahabharat several times, but there is no mention of the Pandavas ever coming here and building a temple, right? So no matter what version of Mahabharat you look into, you will never hear that anybody built any temples during the Mahabharat. And if you look at the temple, if you look at the architecture, it is undoubtedly early medieval, because the earliest ancient Indian temples in the north come from the Gupta Empire, and they're very, very separate from the way these temples look. They're very distinct. They're more like square planned temples, and they're built a certain way. So their architecture is very Indo-Hellenistic in nature, whereas these are more Indianized now. There is a lot of amalgamation of Jain elements and Buddhist elements, and of course the Hindu elements, the emerging Hindu elements from the Gupta period. And what we have is a hybridized kind of iconography, a hybridized style of making sculptures or portraying certain things, right? The second temple we have, again, looks nothing like an ancient or a medieval temple for that matter, is this temple of Hatkoti in Shimla district in Himachal Pradesh. So we've gone from Western Himalayas to the east now. And this is yet another book that is, this is yet another area that is identified with the Virat Nagari, where again the Pandavas supposedly took shelter during their exile. Here we have these 5 stone temples in the side, if you see my cursor, and everybody, all of the locals will tell you that the 5 Pandavas built each temple. But there are also 2 big shrines like this one. So there's one here and there's one right next to it, which is huge, which cannot be captured in a single frame. And they are probably also from a similar period, around 725 CE, right? But everybody will tell you these are the 5 Pandavas. This is Draupadi and their temples. But who is the next big temple from? There is an inscription in this temple that everybody says nobody can read, and a lot of scholars have tried to read it, but nobody has successfully managed to decipher that inscription. But that being said, that is a later period inscription. It's not really an old inscription. It's on a metallic plate. It comes from a much later period. The remains of the former temple, which would have been here, have been taken in and they've been hewn into this modern looking pagoda style temple, which is known as the Kathkuni style of architecture in Himachal Pradesh. They've gone and hewn it together, and this is what it looks like. Only these 5 temples in the side retain any kind of authenticity with respect to what the early medieval style used to be. And again, if you're looking at the architecture, if you're doing a comparative analysis and a relative dating of the sculptures, you find that these are very akin to the Gurjar Pratyahara style of making sculptures. Now, it is worth mentioning here that even if in Himachal there is not a lot of dating with respect to Gurjar Pratyahara temples, their iconography and the way they are built have been already analyzed. Dr. Handa from ASI has gone on to do this. And he has published, he was from the Kurukshetra circle of ASI. And he has gone on to write this entire book on sculptures of the Pratyahars. How are they distinct? Similarly, in Madhya Pradesh, Dr. Rahman has gone on to write complete books on how Gurjar Pratyahara temples differ from the later period temples, from the Chandela temples or other Gupta period temples from the past. Because again, in Madhya Pradesh, you have more surviving and well-dated sculptures and temples as well, where the inscriptions are legible, they're readable, they've been read and they've been deciphered. So we know that this is what it looks like. And when you compare it with these, you find that there is an obvious similarity. So it's not just 2 things looking the same way, it's also being built and constructed the same way, which means they're following the same canons of architecture and iconography as well as iconometry while creating these structures. There is another temple now. From Shimla, we move a little northwards. So we are in Kullu now. And in Kullu, again, we have another temple, which is supposedly built by the Pandavas. This is the Vishveshwar temple, also called the Bijeshwar temple now. And this is in Bajora in Kullu, bang in the middle of the town. You might just drive past it without realizing what it is, but it's right there. And again, it's distinctive Pratyahara style. Now, this, interestingly, is a temple that has been identified by ASI as an 11th century Pratyahara temple. Again, the local myth is the Pandavas built it, but it has been identified. It has a board on the site. ASI people and ASI records will tell you that this is definitely a Gurjar Pratyahara temple. For some reason, archaeology in Himachal Pradesh has been very, very favorable to all these sites in Kullu and Manali. And I don't know whether it's because these are touristic sites and they've always been popular touristic sites, or because there was some kind of actual archaeology going on. But a lot of Gurjar Pratyahara temples have been definitely dated, studied, and analyzed. ASI has gone on to put boards there. These are not ticketed monuments. They're very much active sites. They're used for prayer even today. But everybody knows what they are, and everybody knows that these are Pratyahara period temples as opposed to the earlier 2 that I showed you. Now, again in Manali, we have the Shiva temple in Jagatsukh. This is dedicated to Lakulish Shiva and Shiva avatars. Again, this is dated by the ASI as an 8th to 9th century temple. Once again, ASI says it's Gurjar Pratihar. A local person will still come and tell you it was built by the Pandavas. Right next to this temple is another temple called the Gauri Shankar temple in Kullu. So these two temples are about 10 kilometers from each other. So it doesn't really take long for you to go from here to here. This is yet again an identified temple by ASI, and they say it's late Pratihar, it's 11th to 12th century. Now, if you look into their architectural styles, you can see what's going on here. You have a very square plan here, and from here, you've gone on to a plan that is essentially circular. So on that circle, then, they've gone on to build this very circular looking Garbhagriha. And they, like I said, the temple itself is not really a complete circle like the Indian Parliament, but the circular floor plan is very, very distinct. There is a lot of carving that's going on. A lot of things have been carved on the same surface as compared to a simpler style that was followed in the earlier times of the Gurjar Pratihar. And again, a dated site, a site with an archaeological survey board, authentically Gurjar Pratihar and decided. Lastly, we come to the Gayatri temple, also in Jagatsukh. This is rebuilt. ASI again says it's 8th to 9th century, but there was the earthquake, the famous Kangra earthquake that shook almost all of Himachal Pradesh. And this bigger temple was then lost. What the locals have gone on and done is built it again in the Kathpuni style of architecture. But if you looked into the sculptures, there are sculptures embedded in the wall. If you look into those sculptures, you will find that the other temple, the Shiva temple at Jagatsukh, which is also very close to this structure, you will be able to find the comparisons. You'll also find that there are certain figures that may have been a part of the Shiv temple perhaps, but have now been moved into the Gayatri temple. It is very likely that the Gayatri temple was probably not a Gayatri temple originally at all. There is a shrine to Gayatri today within this temple, but whether it's a dated sculpture, no, it's not. The stone sculptures very much hint that this was a Shiv temple, and the other Shiv temple, the smaller one, was probably a subsidiary shrine. And this is yet another big giveaway. The Gurjar Pratihars, towards the second or the middle phase of their temple building, started liking building things in a quincunx pattern, which meant one shrine in the middle and 4 shrines on the side, which very much looks like how 5 looks like on your die, on your gaming die, right? So they built temples in that format. And we have evidence of those temples from Haryana, definitive Gurjar Pratihara temples from Haryana that are built in quincunx patterns around the 8th and the 9th century. This is again an 8th and the 9th century temple. This is in Manali, and this doesn't really look like an 8th century temple anymore, but it probably looked like that. We also have a lot of encroachment in the area. Now, this is not really encroachment in the modern sense of the way, but these houses have been there for centuries now, and people can't be asked to leave and vacate now. So while they haven't really encroached upon the temple in the modern sense of encroachment, these houses have now made further excavations impossible in the area. So there is no scope for future archaeology. How can I find whether all these theories are correct, or how can I test them even further if I can hold more excavations on the site? Sadly, that is not possible. Also, in Himachal Pradesh, a lot of these sites post the 1904 earthquake have been rebuilt and redesigned this way. So it's very difficult to locate them. Essentially, you have to go from temple to temple, look at the sculpture, analyze those sculptures for all their values, compute those values, and then come up with, okay, this is Gurjar Pratihar versus no, this may not be Gurjar Pratihar. Now, like I said, around the same time in Chamba, we have the Varmans, and they emerge as rulers. They also heavily engage in temple building, much like the Gurjar Pratihars. Their temples, again, are dated, so 9th to 11th century. The Chamba Varman kings are building these temples. A lot of people have written about the Varmans because their inscriptions are still out there. Also, Chamba famously has a very well curated museum that was started by Jean-Philippe Vogel, who was one of the first few people studying the archaeology of the Rajputs. And he went on to transcribe their documents, their copper plate inscriptions, as well as their later letters. And that is still on display in the museum. So if you ever go to Chamba, go to the Bhuri Singh Museum, which is one of the best museums in Himachal Pradesh, where you will find all these inscriptions and what they say, including stone slabs and fountain inscriptions that have been taken inside the museum. They have been transcribed and they have been presented to you. You can even buy a book on them. So what the inscription says is available as books that the museum takes out as their own publications. And in those, again, you find this whole thing about we are the feudatories of the Gurjar Pratihar kingdom or the Gurjar Pratihar kings. And these are the areas that we occupy on authority through the Gurjar Pratihars. So these then give us a very concrete hint, because architecturally, the architecture is very, very similar to all other places. But the Varmas go on to tell you what all areas they ruled. So you know for a fact that this area is under the Varmas, who in turn are under the Gurjar Pratihars, which means the rest of the temples that follow similar architectural style would be Gurjar Pratihar as well. Like all Himachali temples, you can see a chatar here on the top, which wasn't there in the first place. And again, the reason is the top of the spire fell because of the 1904 earthquake, which was one of the most devastating earthquakes to hit this region, which also has sadly affected the archaeology of the region. We know that traders were encouraged to build temples, specifically if traders had some kind of windfall gain in the area while traveling. We also know that Himachal fell through the trade route, which then went on to link with the Silk route. NH1A, which passes through Himachal Pradesh, was very much a part of the Uttar Path, which linked India to the trade route. And it went all the way from there, linking all the way into Peshawar and then to the main trade route artery for the Silk route. And we know that these temples were built along the trade route. So if you know where the trade route was and if you've mapped it, fortunately for us, these studies have already been done. If you map these temples on a modern day map and juxtapose them, you will find that each of the temple was either on an inland waterway or directly along the trade route. And what does that tell us? Again, if you go back to that big spider diagram I showed you, the temples were not just built religiously. So let us summarize what we've understood from this talk about Gurjar Pratihars, their temple building, and how that fits into the early temples of Himachal Pradesh. Number one, Gurjar Pratihars are an emergent caste group who are probably deemed illegitimate when they first come into power. And in order to negotiate their identity and establish their authority to rule over people, they need to legitimize their power. Now, who legitimizes your power in the traditional Indian context? The Brahmin. How do you appease the Brahmin? By giving him a land grant. And what would that land grant include? Probably building a temple. You are also dealing at this point in early medieval, around 6th and 7th century, which is when they're coming into power, with different sects within Hinduism fighting each other for patronage, and also fighting Jainism and Buddhism for patronage. No wonder then we have an emergent style that is combining features of all these architectural elements. They're combining things from the Buddhist myths, they're combining motifs from the Buddhist and the Jain canons, and they're marrying them into the Hindu canon. And so you have these temples that are an amalgamation of all these architectural and structural styles. Of course, there is also the question of patronage. So say the preceding dynasty was removed. Whoever they were patronizing, again, the artists would flock somewhere and they would come to the new Raja or to the new king. And that is how these temples have composite features. Again, there is a very strong social current of creating structures that are sacred to everybody living within the empire. What is the one way in which you invade a certain population and make sure that they don't revolt against you? You honor their traditions. And how do you honor their traditions? You build temples that are sacred. You build temples which can have mythical origins, and those myths can pertain and percolate into all kinds of religions and all kinds of sects living in that society. So of course, there's that angle to that also. So you're appeasing the Brahmin, you're creating a temple, you're appeasing the population. The temples are built along the trade route, which means if I am a traveler and if I am a trader and I'm going somewhere, I can go into the temple, deposit all my money there, get a bill of exchange written from the temple, go to another temple in that empire, show that bill of exchange, and retrieve all that money that I had deposited there. So it's working as a makeshift bank. I am not making this up. All of this has been proven, has been tested, and these things have been going on in India even in the Buddhist times. So even in caves along the Silk Route in the Western Ghats, this practice of depositing money by a traveler into one of the caves or in one of the chaityas and vihars, and then getting that money back through a bill of exchange from another has already been established. Dr. Osman Boparachi has gone on to study this in extreme, excruciating detail on how it worked in the Buddhist times. And this practice continued very much up until the later period, until we have the Muslims coming in and building the caravansarais, which is where the banking system completely changed and the caravansarais start doing this. Temples are almost invariably located along trade routes so that they can support the economy. Resultantly, if I made a gain as a traveler or a trader, what am I going to do? I'm going to give money to build temple. So we have a temple, which again falls in the same date range, again in Himachal Pradesh, which is the Baijnath temple in Kangra, which was built by the proceedings of these two traders who had come from elsewhere, and they had made a lot of money. Because they had made a lot of money, they went, okay, here is the money, please build a temple here on the trade route. This is our contribution back to your economy. So temples at once are tools of negotiating identity, tools of trade, tools of social unification and religious unification, and also a way in which people are negotiating their own identity. I have built a temple. I am a descendant of the Pandavas. I am a Chandravanshi Rajput. Acknowledge my power. I am destined to rule. I have right to rule over you. And that is essentially what the Gurjar Pratyahars have done. And no wonder, even today, if you talk to the locals, a lot of these temples are identified as having been built by the Pandavas. They've forgotten the descendant bit. So also the descendant bit doesn't really sound very cool, you know. If I'm making up an oral myth about my area, I wouldn't say, oh, this was built by the descendants of the Pandavas. I would say Pandavon ne banwaya. You know, they were the ones who came in and they made it. Why should I say the descendants of the Pandavas built this? So this is essentially what has gone and happened. Yet, despite the sheer wealth of early medieval temples from Himachal Pradesh, very little has been done in archaeological documentation, research, and analysis. Like I said, also in the previous part in this talk, we have a lot that has been done in Kullu Manali, but sadly not as much in Kangra or in other regions where these temples are. In Shimla, almost all of these temples are lost because they have been rebuilt in the Kathkuni style. Even if they're still there, people are just looking for reasons to build a new structure on top of it, house the same old figurines within, and sometimes a lot of these are lost. We have, in the course of 4 years that we were working in this project, gone to these different temples trying to document everything. Of course, I haven't shown you these because there's nothing remaining of these temples. You just have an isolated sculpture or two. But when you go to them, they tell you there were hundreds of sculptures on this site and there were hundreds of things. We have gone and taken them to Haridwar and we have immersed them into the Ganga. So a lot of these archaeological things, these archaeological nuggets are lost to us by way of research, analysis, and documentation because those things no longer survive. And of course, the local beliefs, the local superstitions, as well as the religious way of doing certain things always interferes with the archaeological way of doing something. And you can't really negotiate with people there. This is their active heritage. They're the active stakeholders. You can't just barge in and say, I know better because I'm an archaeologist. Please surrender this to me. Resultantly, all of this has been lost. But that is where we come in as an organization at Speaking Archaeologically. We aim to digitize these temples. We aim to document whatever little we can find. And we want to look into the networks and relationships between their archaeology and the present oral day myths. We also want to study their distribution using GIS analysis. So while it may sound like it's a bleak and a lost cause, I promise you that it is not. This is, like I said, a huge project, a huge thing that we've been doing. And now we will be taking it even further. So as soon as we have a set of researchers who are bent on learning all these analytical skills and are bent on working on these sites, we will again be taking up this project and mapping these temples so that we can possibly come up with a predictive model. Once we know where these temples are locationally and what are the features, we know that they're along the trade route. We know that they're either along a river or along the ancient route. Once we have documented it with respect to other archaeological evidence that we've been gathering from museums in India and around the world, we will then be thinking of creating a predictive model so that we have a concrete picture of where they were located. So why are we doing this? Because it's speaking archaeologically, we believe forgotten history is forgotten culture. So we are not necessarily maniacal people who like to make our lives difficult. We are people with a mission. We believe that this will give us a comprehensive picture of what's going on in Himachal Pradesh. If we understand the early medieval better, perhaps we will also understand the late medieval a little bit better. And we will also understand why Himachal was colonized, why it was retained as a colony for the longest time. Yes, there was the whole temperature thing that it is weather-wise similar to England in some respects. But what other factors, what other things made Himachal such a strong and important holding in the British times? Because again, equally at speaking archaeologically, we work towards decolonization of culture and understanding the politics of colonialism. How did that happen? Why did that happen? What was being retrieved? And how can we rewrite that narrative that was written for us by people from elsewhere rather than indigenous hands who understand the culture and who understand the theories better? So this is a selected bibliography that I based my talk today on. And thank you so much for your patience. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Shreya, for such a excellent talk on Himachal Pradesh, the temples of Himachal Pradesh. And if our audience, if you have any queries, please post them in the chat box and we can take them up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanathan. I hope I've stopped sharing my screen. I don't really see it anymore, but I do see questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
So
Let me read it out. We have our CEO, sir, Imani Shivanagi sir. He's saying the lecture is excellent, requesting you to please clarify. There is a few questions. Let us go through one by one. What were the Shilpa texts the Gurjara Pratiharas had consulted?
Thank you so much for that question, sir, and thank you for the compliment. We have a whole set of Shilpa texts that we found that they were referring to. When it came to their iconography and their temple style of, specifically when it came to the Talaman. So what were they looking in terms of iconometric analysis? They relied very heavily on the Matsya Puran for all their Shaivite sculptures. But we also sometimes find that they're referring to the Linga Puran for how to build shivlings, because we have huge shivlings from the Gurjar Pratyahara period. In the later periods, the shivlings aren't that big. Of course, we have exceptions in Madhya Pradesh where you have that one huge shivling in the Shiva temple. But in Gurjar Pratyahara period, you have a lot of reliance on the Linga Puran, the Matsya Puran, and the Shiv Puran for building the Shaivite sculptures. Again, if you would have noticed, all these temples that I showed you were predominantly Shiva or Devi temples. So we do find that compared to other things, there is an exception once or twice where you would have a Vishnu temple, but their thrust area for some reason was always the Shaivite temples. Now, this could probably be because Shaivism was more inclusive in terms of the native cults. So you have the Pashupat cult, for example, which is the cult of worshipping the animals. And that can be very easily incorporated with who Shiva is. Similarly, there's a Lakulish cult, and we have a Shiva Lakulish temple from Manali. So again, Lakulish is a celibate, and he's a yogi. He was probably a local lord somewhere or a local person somewhere, and his cult has also now been merged with Shiva. So their reliance in terms of the Shilpa Shastras are these. They also, at times, when it comes to the Vishnu temples, make use of the Vishnu Dharmotra Puran, but almost all Shaivite sculptures are Matsya Puran or Ling Puran predominantly in terms of the sculptural analysis. In terms of architecture, We are not able to come up with what they were following. Yes, they were following Vastu Shastra, but Vastu Shastra that we read today was written much later, again by the Gurjar Pratyahar king, King Bhoj. Meher Bhoj goes on to compile that. And that happens much later in the 11th century. So, yes, we know that they were following Vastu Shastra, but what form of it were they following? We don't really know yet.
There is a few more questions from sir. Could you please throw some light on the temple forms of the Pratiharas?
So broadly, the temple forms can be divided into those three phases that I showed you, which is phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So phase 1 is 725 CE, which is where there is a lot of experimentational style. So they're making all kinds. There's no definitive pattern to how that temple could be. It could be a square plan and it could be a one-room temple. It could be a rectangular plan and it could be a huge temple. It could be a plus kind of a form in which they're building a temple that is curvilinear. So they have all kinds of experimentation going on in phase 1. It is in phase 2 that we see that they start preferring a much more uniform rectangular plan in terms of building the temple. They also show a preference for the Quinkang's Panchayatna style, which is one big shrine in the middle and four subsidiary shrines in the side. In the last phase, they then go on towards the circular thing. So if you always look at the floor plan, it's always circular. So you can measure from the center the radius of the temple. That is what they're following towards the 11th and the 12th century, which is right towards the end of this particular empire. But yeah, those are the three main ways in which you could look at the temple forms. Early temples, everything happening on the same site. Usually a lot of temples like we saw in Masroor. So about 100, 110 shrines together in one place only. And there is no definitive pattern. They're experimenting with rock cut temples. They're equally building them in Haryana. We have a site where they've gone and built indiscriminately n number of temples on the same site, on the same plane. And this is in Pehava, which is where you also go to bury your dead in the North Indian Hindu traditions. So in Pehava, they do that. But if you move northwards slowly, you start getting a more rectangular pattern. When you look at these styles, it is very easy to tell which temple would have been built earlier compared to which temple came in later. Of course, there's also the iconographic traditions that change. But if you were solely focusing on the floor plan, you know that if you have stumbled upon a site with hundreds of Gurjar Pratihara temples with absolutely no plan, this was probably the initial phase. If it's more rectangular, you know that you're dealing with 800 CE. And if you're coming with a circular plan, then you know for a fact that you are in that phase where it's 11th to 12th century CE.
Is there any peculiar features of the temple architecture of the Pratiharas when compared to the neighboring contemporary rulers? And I have another question on similar lines. Is there any iconographical feature or a unique motif uh, uh, in Himachali these temples, early medieval temples, which we don't find in anywhere else, whether they are Gurjar Pratiharas or something like that?
So iconographically, Gurjar Pratyahars are very standardized. That is the thing. So even if you're looking at a temple in, say, Madhya Pradesh, where of course the temple dimensions will be much wider because they have more room. Himachal, you've got the hills. So your temples have got to be smaller and narrower. The Garbhagriha has to be shorter or smaller. Um, Invariably, regardless of the size of the temple, they will always make similar kinds of temples in terms of the floor plan, in terms of following the Vishnu Dharmottara Puran or the Matsya Puran and the Linga Puran for whatever sculptures they're making. So these three Purans are very standardized. If you look into specifics, and this is what we did, we looked into specifics of what does this particular text say about, say, Uma Maheshwar sculptures. Now, what are the Gurjar Pratihars doing? And do you find that throughout all the temples that they've built? So if there is an Uma Maheshwar sculpture in Madhya Pradesh, is it the same as the Uma Maheshwar sculpture that I probably found in Kullu? Yes. So they are following a standardized form. There is no signature. There's no Himachali signature versus other Gurjar Pratihara temple signature. The only Himachali signature, if at all, would be the temples are much narrower, and that is the landscape playing on it. Iconographically, they're very consistent. Temple architecture, the temple plan wise, they're very consistent. Talmain wise, the iconometry wise, they're very, very consistent. They're not very consistent in terms of the size of the temple. So temples are shorter, smaller as you go northwards. They're bigger, wider as you come southwards. That's the only thing.
Could you find any names of the Shilpins in the Pratihara period? Any sculptors' names?
So for the Shilpins, we did find a few inscriptions, but we only found them in northern Haryana. So lower Shivalik Hills, in the area of Morni Hills and Pinjore, which is where it sort of merges into the plain. We did find a few inscriptions. However, those inscriptions we could not read. We thought they were Sarda script, and we took it to an expert because they were not Brahmi. I personally read Brahmi, so I read right up until the Gupta Brahmi, and it wasn't Brahmi. A lot of people go like, oh, they're very similar looking. Could it be Shankhalipi? Could it be Sarda? But it wasn't Shankhalipi or Sarda either. So those bits we haven't been able to read, but we are very sure that they're maker's marks. Because there are characters, of course. There is a matra there and everything. You've got the diacritics. There was something written, but what is it? It doesn't make a word. It doesn't make any sense. There's this huge inscription that we have from one of the sites in Morni Hills called Thakurdwara Temple. Again, it has been reconstructed completely. They've built it into a new temple, but they've embedded the inscription, which is broken into 5 fragments through different walls. So we can't tell where the inscription started and where it ended and what parts would have fit together. But yes, there are inscriptions. There are also maker's marks, like I said, within sculptures and on floor plinths, but we don't have any idea as to what it says. One distinct thing that we also find is every time they build a Panch Yatna temple, they have a diagram etched on one of the pillars. We found this in Gwalior, we found this in Madhya Pradesh, we also found it in Himachal Pradesh as well as in Pinjore in one of the temples. So Pinjore, you've got a lot of temples, all of them are lost. Only 3 remaining temples, which are not intact, they're just sculptural remains from those temples. One of them had that floor plan. So we know that every time they built a Panch Yatna floor plan, they were drawing this on a pillar for some reason. Why they were drawing that particular thing, why they were drawing only that particular mandal, we don't know. Whether it was a reference point or whether it was, okay, this is how we are going to ascertain the architectural features. We don't know that. But that is yet another signature, which is again Pratyahara, but has nothing to do with the region in which they're building.
Uh, Suresh Mogli Chandu, sir, he is appreciating your talk. Excellent, madam. And more information about Himachal Pradesh, known many things about Mahabharata time. I think he is asking whether there is any reference to Himachal during in the epic Mahabharata.
Thank you so much for that question, sir. For the longest time, I was trying to do that. I had Mahabharat in my lap and I would go like, okay, this place, let's try to find it. So when you come to Sthal Puran, which is what Mahabharat has now become for a lot of regions in India, every time you don't understand the archaeology of something, everybody just goes on and says the Pandavas made it. When did they make it? During the Agyatwas. It's very simple. So a lot of places in Himachal claim to be so and so place in Mahabharat, and they will tell you on very strong authority as well. You know, like with Kangra, they said Trigarth is Kangra. But when you actually look up Mahabharat, and when you look up Mahabharat in the most original version you can find, these places don't really find any mention there. So a lot of this is also the way Indian research has been carried out from the 1970s onwards, where a lot of people have just gone on and quoted secondary sources saying, oh, this place is mentioned in Mahabharata. Oh, this way of making something is mentioned in the Rig Veda. But when you actually open the text, there is not much evidence. We know for a fact that Kangra is mentioned. We know for a fact that modern day Noorpur, which is also in Kangra, was called Dhameri, that is mentioned. These are the only places that have also yielded PGW ware, which BB Lal associated with Mahabharat sites. So if it was a Mahabharat site, then you have found PGW pottery there. So only these areas have yielded something. But then again, excavation in Himachal has always been very sporadic. There's no uniform way of excavating. Sometimes a site has been opened up for maybe one season, half a season, 1 month, and nobody has gone on and opened it again. So it is an area where there's a lot of archaeological scope that is yet to be done. I personally do like the whole BB Lal way of investigation, in the sense that we do know that wherever Mahabharat has been mentioned, or whatever places Mahabharat mentions, has yielded PGW pottery. I think that is a very good investigative approach that should be followed in case of Himachal also. So maybe we can try with the sites that people say that the Mahabharat mentions. then investigate whatever areas we can if there's any pottery that comes out. Unfortunately, whatever little pottery that I have found from sporadic sites, specifically in Shimla, is always redware. It's never PGW. So it's a much later redware. We do have instances of Kushan pottery coming out of the Hatkoti region. So where I showed you the Hatkoti temple, right next to it, because it's next to a river, river stratigraphy flips all your pottery and everything. We have found a lot of Kushan period pottery, but we haven't really found any PGW yet. So again, the whole Mahabharat linkage of Heart Koti again is questionable. They say it's the Virat kingdom, but there's no way to show or prove. And now we've got indiscriminate construction in Himachal Pradesh going on. So a lot of these sites are lost even before anybody knew there was a site here.
Anjali ma'am is asking a question. Do you find any Gurjar Pratihara temple in Chamba region? Also, are you looking at sculptures at Gurpar?
We are not really looking at any sculptures in Gurpar, but in terms of Chamba region, all the temples that you have in Chamba have an inscription. That is the most fantastic thing about Chamba temples. And all of them will invariably say, this king built it. And this king was the feudatory of the Gurjar Pratihars. So they will always associate themselves to the Gurjar Pratihars. They will never say, I am a king in my own right. They will say, I am a king because the Gurjar Lord has let me be the king of this area. So I'm managing this area for the Gurjar Pratihar king. So he's the Maharaja Dhiraj and I am the Raja, which means I'm a minor king under him. Is the same with the Chandela temples that you find in Khajuraho. They very clearly attribute themselves as the feudatories of Gurjar Pratihars. Now, it is important to understand here that feudalism isn't something that is the same as feudalism in Europe. So while R.S. Sharma went on to write this whole theory about how feudalism happened in post-Gupta period, that is essentially not what's going on in the Gurjar Pratihara period, because one of the main assertions is trade declined. If the trade declined, there was no point of building these temples along the trade route. Secondly, India does not have silver inherently. We do have gold in the Kolar mines in the south, but we are not a silver harnessing country if you look into the raw material in India. Gurjar Pratihars famously issued coins in silver, and you can find their hoards even at the National Museum in Delhi. So we documented a few of them. Where are you getting silver from if there is no trade? So feudalism in India in the post-Gupta period is not the feudalism that R.S. Sharma thought was there. What he did was he just took up Henri Pirren's model of feudalism in Europe and applied it verbatim to Indian context. But that's not what's going on. Yes, there is the Hun invasion. Yes, there is a lot of foreign threat. Yes, you have the Muslims eventually invading the 1100s. But you have to understand that it is commerce that precedes conquest in India. Specifically in North India, because there is trade going on, there will invariably be a tribe that will follow these people and then raid the empire. But saying that there was no trade, saying that nothing was going on is not true. So when they say they're feudatories, they're very much managing the estate on their own. A while ago, we found another inscription at the Alwar Museum, which is also of a similar sort, which talks about Gurjar Pratihar, main lord, and then the side lord who's managing an empire. And we have released that on the Speaking Archaeologically Instagram as well as on the Speaking Archaeologically YouTube channel. We've talked at length about what the inscription says and what we find out about the Gurjar Pratihars through that inscription. So we have a lot of information coming in terms of who was building what temple under what Pratihara king. So in Chamba, saying that a temple is purely Varma is also not correct. And saying that the temple is Gurjar Pratihara only is also not correct because it's the Varmas building for the Gurjar Pratihars.
Surendra has an interesting question regarding the Hatkoti temples, and do they exhibit uniform architecture style and belongs to the same chronological phase, or do they reflect multiple construction period over time?
So they distinguishingly show that they're uniform. So their size is the same. They're the same length, they're the same width, they're the same everything. The Sukansas or the Gavaks are located exactly on the same facade and everything. The main two temples were destroyed during the earthquake, like I mentioned. And again, what has been done is the Katkuni style has come to rescue. They've gone on, they put plinth on plinth on plinth. So you have one stone slab, then you have one wooden plinth, then you have smaller decorative stones, then you have that. So it is not put together in your quintessential mortar and plaster formation. It's just one thing heaped on top of the other, and it will not fall off. If it does, if there's an earthquake tomorrow and if it falls off, you just go on and do the same thing. But that has only been done for the main ones. The smaller 5 temples are exactly the same shape, same size, same everything. The only thing that is varying in those smaller ones are the Gavaksha motifs. So on one you will have just Shiva, as Mahesh. On one you have the Trimurti Shiva. On one you have Bhairav. On one you have Bhadra. So you have all these things going on. But other than that, they're absolutely the same.
Kiran Kochare has a question. Ma'am, can you give us any insights regarding the shikaras of the temples of the region?
Very little to say there, Kiran, because when you look at the shikhars of the temple in Himachal Pradesh, they're all Nagar style. Like I said, the Gurjar Pratyahars are pretty consistent. They don't care if they're in Himachal Pradesh or in Haryana or in Madhya Pradesh or even in Jammu and Kashmir. There are 2 temples from Jammu and Kashmir that are Gurjar Pratyahar because famously the Gurjar Pratyahars could not invade Kashmir. The Raja had thrown them away. So there are only 2 or 3 temples that we've documented in that region. And they're towards Udhampur and also towards the Samba region, which is right towards the Himachal and Jammu border. But they could not go beyond that particular limit. And when you look at the temples, it's always consistently curvilinear Nagar style, you know. And what they do is they do the brick infill. So Adam Hardy went on to study how they were making these shikharas. And what they did was they had these hoops, iron hoops. And those iron hoops would interlink one tile to the other, and they would sort of put it up together like a modern day Lego thing. And that is consistent. Interestingly, in Haryana and also in parts of Himachal Pradesh, we found a few temples where you could see those brackets where those hoops went, and those hoops were still there. In a lot of these places, these have been pilched, so people have gone and found that iron. They had great metallurgy, it hasn't rusted. People have gone and turned it into rings, and they're wearing it as rings and everything. We actually had somebody come up to us on one of the sites we were documenting saying, oh, you see that ring here that came out of that tile, वो उसके पीछे लगा था, and we took it out and we forged it into a ring, and almost everybody in the village has a ring that came from this temple. So they've gone on and done that. So consistently they're doing the same thing architecturally. But yeah, like if you look at the shikhar style, it is the Nagar style triangular shikhar. There is all that is to it. It is topped by an amalka. There would have been a kalash on the top, and that's about it.
Yeah. Let's take one question from the YouTube as well. Vasudha Deshmukh is asking Katuri temples in Uttarakhand from same period. Do they influenced by Pratihara temples?
We haven't really surveyed any temples in Uttarakhand. The reason being that Uttarakhand has a lot of temples which are also from the time of Prithviraj Chauhan, and they follow the same kind of things. So I partly come from Uttarakhand. My mother is Uttarakhandi. Pithoragarh is known as Pithoragarh because Pithora is the title Prithviraj Chauhan adopted. Kila Rai Pithora in Delhi is Prithviraj Chauhan's killa, right? So we have a lot of later period Chauhan temples, which are also following similar temple architectural styles. There's also a 13th century Baijnath temple, same name as the one in Kangra, in Uttarakhand in Almora region. Very similar architecturally, but we don't know whether it is Gurjar Pratihar or whether it is later period. Again, the Chauhans call themselves the descendants of the Pratihars, saying that they came out of the same sacrificial fire in the Agni Kul, but they do not say that they're feudatories of the Pratihars. So we don't know whether these temples are Gurjar Pratihar or they're being built for the Gurjar Pratihars, or this is an independent style that has emerged because of the Gurjar Pratihara influence. In this case, the temple would look structurally very similar to this, but there might be fine lines that one might be able to glean out and say, okay, this is how this temple is different, this is how this temple does not follow the Gurjar Pratihara signature, so on and so forth.
There are many messages which are appreciating your lecture. And
thank you so much.
Then Sanjay Bandari, he's asking, did you find any sources on the influence of Gurjar Pratihara in the Sutlej Valley region? For example, the Chandi Devi temple and ancient Bauli near Nirmad, the Suryanarayan temple at Nirat in
Rampur Bushahar,
Gurjar,
yes.
and the Nagara temple in the Bhimkalai temple complex.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Bhandari. Yes, all of these temples are Gurjar Pratihar, and yes, we have surveyed all of them. With Bhima Kali, it is slightly difficult to look into the Gurjar Pratihara signature because if you've been there, you would have noticed that they have gone on and done the same thing, which is Katkuni architecture. Again, it's the active temple. It belonged to the temple belonged to the former chief minister, Raja Veerbhadra Singh, and his family, because his royal family, it's their Isht Devi. So entry to the temple is barred. You can't go unless it's summer. You have to follow and respect the royal family's wishes because they still pray there and they still worship there. And every time it opens up, it is a thronging with tourists. So when you want to do an archaeological investigation, preferably you want the temple at a time that nobody is there. So our preferred time is we go at dusk when people are leaving and we know nobody's praying there. So before it is 8 o'clock, go quickly, go around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock when everybody is gone and nobody is in the temple. But with Bhima Kali, you don't have that access. So we wanted to do a detailed investigation for that. We could not. But for as far as Nirmand is concerned and Suryanarayan temple is concerned, yes, they are active temples and they are Gurjar Pratihar. The only problem with the Sun temple, the Suryanarayan temple, is they've painted over the tiles. So when you've done that, when you've gone on and plastered it with modern day paint, two things happen. A, predominantly all Gurjar Pratihara temples are sandstone. Whether it's red sandstone or grey black sandstone is immaterial, but they're always sandstone. Sandstone is highly porous as a rock, which means anything that you apply on it goes inside the rock and can start destabilizing the rock from inside. What that essentially leads to is the structure becoming very, very friable. Sandstone also corrodes very quickly. So any iconography on top of sandstone becomes very easily corroded if it's exposed to light, to rain, to any kind of chemical. And that is what has happened at Neerath particularly. Even in the Chandi Devi temple near Nirmand, we have something similar. There are a few temples in the Guler region. There are a few temples in Mandi region that could have easily been Gurjar Pratihara. But all of these features that we have used to identify iconographically have completely been washed off. A lot of people will come and tell you, oh, the Muslim invaders came and destroyed it. No, it is you people going painting and distempering on the top of the temple walls, which is making those features disappear. Because you've got the whole structure intact. You know that there is a silhouette of something, but you can't identify the Lord anymore. We had this very difficult sculpture that we encountered at one of the sites. For the longest time, we couldn't tell you what it was. Nothing was destroyed. The head was still there, but you could see no features. It was completely wiped clean. Even the animals in the background, you could tell there is an animal, but you could not identify what animal it was. So for the longest time, we could not tell you what that was. And it was only much later that somebody from the iconography department went, no, 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 this is a Bhairav sculpture. Look at the hood, look at the flaming head and this and that. So this is probably Bhairav. For the longest time, I can tell you, we had no idea what it was because sandstone had been painted on. And that is essentially what has happened a lot in Nirmand region, not so much in Rampur Bushahar. Rampur Bushahar, they're pretty much there. They're pretty much the same temple. But again, with Katkuni and with local restrictions in terms of who owns the temple, who's the main stakeholder, archaeological investigation has been slightly difficult.
Dr. Lakshmi Devi has a question. Chintapurna Devi temple is it related to the anyway
Gurjar
Gurjar
Katharas.
Pratiharas?
Not that I can confirm or deny. I have been to Chintapurni temple, but it is again modernized to such an extent that I can't tell you on authority that it probably is related or not related. When you I think one of the talks that I gave initially at Himachal, which is where I met Dr. Sanatan also, I talked about how vernacular architecture and vernacular practices are hampering identification of temples in Himachal Pradesh. So when you look at early medieval temples in Himachal Pradesh, if they are broken, if they are damaged in some way, locals always take it onto their hands and they go like, okay, this is what I'm going to do to this temple. I'm going to rebuild it again or I'm going to paint it again. because this is our heritage, this is our dharohar. So we want to protect it. And it is a place of God. So let us turn it into a temple all over again. What they don't realize while doing it is they're not preserving the temple, they're actually damaging the archaeology. It's not just with early medieval temples, the same is also true for late medieval temples. A while ago, I was talking at Intact Delhi about this temple, which is late medieval. It's a 16th, 17th century temple from the area of Nahan, where you have frescoes. You have these original Nahan style frescoes, which is a distinctive Pahadi school of art, which is not the same as the Kangra school of art or the other Pahadi schools. It has its own features, it has its own unique palette and iconographic styles of making frescoes. It's an active temple. And because the locals want the temple for the temple's sake, they've gone and they've plastered over the frescoes because frescoes are gathering dust and soot. They are infested by lichens and by moss and all these microorganisms. It's difficult to treat. They don't even know it can be treated, or there are people specializing in it. So what they've gone and done is they've painted right over it. There are two Jagannath temples, very interesting. Maharaja Sirmaur, 16th century, went to Jagannath Puri and really fell in love with the deity and had a lot of faith towards the deity. So he brought these two wooden idols of Jagannath from Odisha and he installed one of them in a temple in Nahan itself. So Nahan has a Jagannath temple. And then there is another one in the periphery, in the Nahan Solan border. There is another Jagannath temple. So there are wooden idols there as well. If you go to these temples today, there is nothing medieval about these temples. There is nothing medieval about the idols. They've gone on and painted it over. They've tried to make it more secure because wood corrodes and wood also gets termite and wood ants. In Himachal, wood ants is equally a big problem as termites are. So they've gone on to paint over it and sculpt over it, and they've sort of encased the real idol with all of that, with plaster of Paris and with other things. And that has just made it very difficult to study it archaeologically. So while heritage-wise, we are still continuing worshipping these temples. These sites are not really lost in the quintessential archaeological sense of the way, but archaeological investigation has become impossible.
Shreya, thank you so much on my personal behalf and on behalf of Pleach India Foundation. I'm very happy and thank you once again for your excellent talk, very informative talk on the early medieval temple culture of Himachal Pradesh. And we also thank our audience for their participation and making our Pleach talk so memorable today. And for updates about our upcoming Pleach talks and many other initiatives, please keep on checking our recently launched website, pleachindia.org. Thank you all once again.
Thank you so much once again, Dr. Sanatan, for the invite and everybody at the Pleach platform for allowing me to talk about this. Thank you also to the audience for their wonderful questions. And for anybody who would like to keep in touch or would want to know more, we are everywhere. Speaking Archaeologically is perhaps one organization. All you need to do is put us up on Google and you'll find us shamelessly everywhere on the internet. So if you want to follow our work, you want to follow the temple project, or you want to follow other projects that we're carrying on right now, because like I said, I'm in the UK and there are a few projects that we're sort of manning here as well. So if you want to see what we are up to, we are there. And if you feel like contacting for any of your personal projects, please don't hesitate to do that. I believe personally that archaeology has been in the ivory tower for too long. So archaeologists need to be more accessible to the general public. If anybody would like to keep in touch, please feel free to do so. And thank you once again for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, everybody.